those that have not heard of restorative narrative before, you're really in for a treat. Before I introduce our first two speakers, a couple of important tech notes and some context setting. To start with some context, this event is part of a larger Peace Studio Summit, a series of 12 virtual events that's happening throughout today and throughout this week in celebration of the UN International Day of Peace and the culmination of the Peace Studio's 100 Offerings of Peace campaign, which since July 1 has been commissioning creatives from over 20 countries to generate new works about what peace means to them amidst COVID-19 and the powerful protests over centuries-old racial injustices happening across our globe. If you are free, we hope that you'll consider joining us at 6 o'clock for a special dialogue with legendary choreographer Bill T. Jones, co-founder of the Peace Studio Maya Saturo, and New York Times correspondent John Elligan, amongst others, on peace building during the reckoning for justice, equality, and inclusion. And then at 8 o'clock, we go live with a special gala featuring His Holiness the Dalai Lama, an award that will be honoring Yoko Ono, the actor Ted Danson, Arun Gandhi, and many, many, many others. One more thing, at the end of our session today, there will be a Q&A where we will try to answer as many of your questions as possible, so please feel free to post those questions into our Zoom chat throughout the event. And now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Jillian Ganda, the Program Director for Engagement at the Fetzer Institute, to offer a few words about the important role Fetzer has played in the development of the restorative narrative genre. And truly, we are so grateful to you, Jillian, and to Fetzer for everything that you've done to make both our 100 Offerings of Peace campaign possible and this continued work in restorative narratives. And then directly following Jillian, I'm also thrilled to introduce John Yearwood, who's the Deputy Editor for Trade and Agriculture at Politico, Peace Studio board member and a dear friend. It's really a joy to have Jillian and John here and to have John moderate today's discussion. So with that, I turn it over to you, Jillian.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Thomas. It's really great to be here with everyone to introduce you to this panel. This restorative narrative, it's a genre that I know and love very well based on many years of experience working with Judy Rogers and others at Images and Voices of Hope. They've now beautifully merged with Peace Studio, and I can see that this organization is poised to bring in the new generation of stories focused on restorative narrative, focused on a strength-based approach, led by empathy and revealing resilience. Restorative narrative really captures the realities of those working to reclaim or rebuild their lives and even their stories, even and sometimes including the storyteller. So that says a little bit about why the Fetzer Institute is so interested in this genre and this work. We've long been dedicated to the inner life of spirit as it's integrated with our outer life, our outer actions of service. And to begin that work years ago, well over 10 years ago, we worked with Ivo on a series of thought leadership dialogues to explore the inner life of the journalist, firmly grounded in their belief that media can create meaningful, positive change in the world. And we look forward to future dialogues with Peace Studio. Most recently, we supported restorative narrative fellows, those that were getting trained in the practice and to share their stories out in the world in their medium of choice. This was an amazing body of work. You'll hear about some of these stories today. So welcome, we're glad you came to this conversation where we could focus on the world we want to live in, recognizing that all of us, all individuals, have the capacity to construct a better world, a more loving world, and a more peaceful world. And speaking of peace on this day, I just wanted to say on behalf of the Fetzer Institute, please stay tuned for our launch of a national study we just completed on spirituality in the United States, including a finding that tells us what Americans think is the #1 benefit of spirituality. It's pretty much the theme for today. So thank you so much. This is an incredible body of work. I've been so honored to be a part of it, to be learning alongside so many talented storytellers in our midst. I hope you enjoy the conversation, and I will turn it over to John, who will moderate today. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you very much, Jillian. We really appreciate it and appreciate all the help and support we've received from Fetzer over many, many years. I want to say hello, everyone, and welcome to this, what I hope will be and informative, and also a very important conversation about restorative narrative, why they matter, and how they help us build peace. We're going to do this in 2 parts. First, I want you to hear from Judy Rogers, and then we'll have a conversation with fellows who have participated in restorative narratives. But first, Judy Rogers. Judy is the founder of Images and Voices of Hope. For over 20 years, she worked in media companies, translating the ideas of authors and thought leaders to film. Since 1997, she has worked as an independent consultant, emphasizing the power of dialogue to support social innovation and individual community-wide and system-wide change. Judy is now going to talk to us a bit about the origins of the restorative narrative genre as it relates to images and voices of hope. Judy? Judy, I believe you have your mute button on.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. So it's lovely to be with you. It ought to be a really nice session, so I'll just say a little bit at the setup. So Images and Voices of Hope started over 20 years ago with the question, what is the impact of public image making and public storytelling on society? And we really had 2 kind of pillars. One was a question about reflective practice, which Jillian just brought up, with the belief that if people are going to really change, they need to have some kind of a reflective practice. And then strengths-based media, which is a media based on strengths, that is on inner capacities of the individual. I'm going to go quickly to restorative narrative because that's our focus today. So Images and Voices of Hope, nicknamed IVO, had been going for a long time, from 98 to 2012, when the events of Newtown happened in Newtown, Connecticut. And of course, this broke the country's heart. And the editor of the paper in Newtown, a man named Curtis Clark, was struggling to tell what had to be one of the most tragic stories one can imagine, right? The death of 7-year-olds. And so in the course of struggling to tell the story, he said, we've got to come up with a redemptive narrative. It can't be that Newtown is forever the saddest place in the world. So when I read about this, I called a board member and said, redemptive narrative, this is where we live. And the board member said, well, what about restorative narrative? So we began to focus on this genre. And we held summits and we held colloquiums and we brought together trauma psychologists and journalists and oral historians and media makers of all sorts to talk about what would the genre look like? How would we define the genre? What would be the craft of this genre? So I would never say that, I wouldn't say that we invented restorative narrative. I would say that we named it and we framed it and we began to focus on what's the quality of awareness those in media have to have in order to create stories where the narrative arc is about restoration and recovery. So the last thing I want to say, and then I want to turn it back over, is that I don't think this is just for journalists. It's a stance that all media can take in telling the stories of our times when trauma has become chronic. So we've seen it with advertising, we've seen it with the creation, especially of online museums. We've seen it with the arts. Certainly in journalism, we've focused on it with the support of Fetzer. But I wouldn't say that it's the property only of journalism. So let me be quiet for a bit and you can listen to those who've been in the craft. Thank you.
Judy, before you're completely quiet, and I certainly want you to hang around and spend some time with us and be part of the conversation as we get into the dialogue. But I wanted to get your sense as someone who's been steeped in this for a long time. Why do you think restorative narrative works?
You know, restorative narrative taps into a body of work called positive psychology. And the study of positive psychology is now 20 years old, but in essence, what it says is that when people are in positive emotional states, that is when they are in joy, contentment, awe, gratitude, appreciation, hope, all of these, kindness, compassion, they actually have more capacity. They're more creative, they generate more ideas, they act on more ideas, they're more pro-social, and the research is extensive at this point. It wasn't when we started, but the idea then became that in a time of trauma, to have stories that focused over and over on the traumatizing event weren't going to be sufficient to help people surface the capacity they needed to rebuild. So we were basically taking the research from positive psychology and applying it in media.
Great, thank you, Judy. Now I'd like to bring in Jacqui Banaszynski. Jacqui has been working with Ivo and She is an emerita professor at Missouri School of Journalism, and a faculty fellow at Poynter, and the current editor of Neiman Storyboard, an online community of nonfiction storytellers around the world. While at the St. Paul Pioneer Press, her series AIDS in the Heartland won the 1988 Pulitzer Prize in feature writing. Jacqui, I'd like to bring you in here and have you talk a bit about restorative narrative and the work that that you've been doing with many of these fellows. How would you define it?
Good question. It's a tough one. I was thinking about that this morning, and I realized that, you know, there's that old saying about pornography, you know it when you see it. Well, I think restorative narrative, you know it when you feel it. There's a sense of journalism, you know, the classic sense of journalism is a journalism of relevance. This kind of journalism is a journalism of relatability. So you have a spectrum, and on one side you've got deep investigative journalism, kind of a prosecutorial journalism, which I think is essential in society. And then on the other end, sense. Both are necessary. Everything in the middle is necessary. Informational stories, service stories, where to get the best hamburger, that's all great stuff. But there needs to be a part of journalism that leads with, has all of the values of core journalism storytelling. Let's just call it true storytelling. I could even get into fiction, but that leads with a sense of the human heart, as opposed with the hard prosecutorial data. It can look in a number of ways, John. It can be defined in a number of ways. It can be a moment where somebody sees a light of hope. It can be a moment where somebody realized that they weren't alone. It can be a moment where somebody finds love in the middle of horror. All those things that are true throughout history. So I don't like to put big, firm definitions around things. I prefer to say, let's go find the story that's there, but be open to the fact that the story is about more than data facts. It's also about emotional facts, emotional intelligence, emotional awareness, and an emotional journey.
Now, Jacqui, you've worked with all these fellows. How easy was it for them to see it when they came to you? Did they know exactly that this was a restorative narrative?
Some yes, some people are wired that way. In the same way that some investigative journalists are wired to do a prosecutorial story and find the bad guy and look under the rock. Some people, some journalists are just wired to see the human story. Others struggle. The thing about this sort of journalism as I think is true of any good journalism, is you can't force it. You can't manipulate the story. So some people they're wired and they lean that way. And others, we had to kind of turn that muscle on. And with others, they had a great story, but we had to find that aspect of it, that element of it. You know, I just finished reading Colson Whitehead's The Nickel Boys, won the Pulitzer, I don't know if it was this year or last year. The Nickel Boys was inspired by the journalism done by one of the very first fellows, Ben Montgomery of the Tampa Bay Times at the time. He's freelancing and doing books now. We struggled really hard to find the narrative aspect of Ben's story because it was about the discovery of all these young Black boys and men who were abused and then buried at this place in Florida, at this horrible school in Florida. But we found one because just the search for these boys, the search for their life stories, the search for what happened to them had an element of this kind of human sort of belief that we have to honor the people who have walked before and walk with us. And that's what Ben's story did. And Colson Whitehead, of all people, oh my God, bring him to my dinner table. He turned it into a Pulitzer Prize winning piece of fiction. There you go.
That was a magnificent, really magnificent story. Certainly well told by Ben as well as by Colson. Are there other, narratives that really come to mind that really are hard to forget, hard to shake after listening to a lot of that? I'm wondering if there are others that you recall that are very difficult to forget.
I tend to recall all of them, and I hate to select out, but Elissa's here and she'll talk probably a little bit about her piece, but she started with one story about this reading circle among a group of mothers, women in one of the worst parts of Cincinnati, and ended up turning it into 5 or 6 years of an incredible storytelling in which you saw all kinds of people, including Elissa Blossom. Allie Carson took what she was doing at public radio and has now developed her own operation where she's leading people in stand-ups where they tell their own stories and their stories of healing. People like Jiquanda are going into parts of the community that the rest of the press can't get to because they're so busy chasing the usual stories. Tanika Johnson took a map of Chicago and folded it on half and said, over here are the rich white people and over here are the poor Black people, and let's introduce them to each other. So there's story after story after story. They're all very different, but they all have their own power.
And I want to bring in both Elissa and Jiquanda in a minute, but before I do that, though, I cannot move on without first acknowledging, and I mentioned it in introducing you, your Pulitzer Prize. Restorative narrative is not really new in that, journalists have been writing restorative narratives for a very long time, haven't been calling them that. Even your work, your seminal work on AIDS, would you consider that a restorative narrative? How did you approach that?
Well, I wouldn't have before I met Judy and Ivo, and we started naming all these things. I just thought it was a really good story of the human heart and the human journey. But yeah, looking back, of course it was. It was about two men who learned how to die with incredible grace and dignity and teach the rest of us a lot along the way. I just finished rereading Hiroshima by John Hershey, which I read every year. And, he follows 6 people after the bombing of Hiroshima, and you couldn't ask for a worse story, but I follow these people and they find a way to go forward. So I wouldn't have spent my career doing this kind of work if there hadn't been a model for it. We just didn't call it that. But those were the kinds of stories I was drawn to, was like, wow, because again, I felt them as opposed to just understood or learned them. There was as much a human as an an emotional as an intellectual connection. And those are the stories that always sort of helped me and changed me and drew me forward.
That's amazing. And essentially you mentioned Japan. If we have time before we conclude our discussion, one of the stories that I have written over the years in my career that has had the most impact was out of Japan. And it didn't call it a restorative narrative at the time, but if we have time before we wrap up, I probably want to go back and talk for a bit about that, as well as maybe even read a bit from that story, which was very moving, about how this woman survived the tsunami in Japan a few years ago. Don't go anywhere, Jacqui. We'll come back to you. But I also, since you referenced both Elissa and Jiquanda, I'd like to bring them in to talk about their work and their restorative narrative. First, I want to bring in Jiquanda Johnson, who is the co-founder of Brown Impact Media Group, which is an independent publishing company focused on developing news outlets in underserved communities, including her hometown of Flint, Michigan, where she serves as publisher and editor of flintbeat.com. Jiquanda launched Flintbeat in 2017 in response to a community outpouring for more local news stories from its media outlets. And I'd also like to bring in Elissa Yancey. Elissa is a lifelong learner, leader, and educator. Her background in journalism and education has led her on a rich career journey through corporate and nonprofit America, as well as in the academy. She is an experienced writer and editor serving in top roles in and outside of academia. As seasoned nonprofit founder, she founded A Picture's Worth to marry her passions for creative disruption of outdated systems, equity, community engagement, and story building. Jiquanda, let's start with you and talk about your restorative narrative. Can you first talk about your project for us and how it's going?
Okay, I'm still working on my project, which I'm having struggles with internally as a journalist. One of the things that I've learned through this process is that it was okay to listen and observe. It's like we're always caught up in the daily grind of the newsroom, and I had to learn that that was okay and accept it. And then also that you can't rush the story, because I ran into a couple of obstacles, because it's a story that really hasn't been told as it pertains to the Latino community in Flint. They have a voice, their voice has not been heard, and they have a narrative that's just been waiting to be told. And I ran into barriers, including losing a source that I had been dealing with for an entire year. And she just took off and moved somewhere else, and having to go back in that community and gain trust from others in order to tell the story. So I'm still working on mine, and I'm hoping to have it finished by the end of the year, and also running a newsroom. I have help now. I have somebody on board who can speak Spanish now, which is great. I have a photographer on board, which is also awesome. So there's all these moving parts that I no longer have to focus on, and I could just focus on the storytelling in a way. It's for communities like Flint, the restorative narrative can be really, really powerful, because I consider it sometimes the light at the end of the tunnel. It's when you're caught in something, or you're dealing with crisis and situations, and you can't see your way out of it. You just think there's no way out of it. And then you read a story where they overcame that same obstacle. I think that we do ourselves a disservice if we do not do reporting and storytelling this way. And sometimes for Flint, it can mean life or death, depending on what it is and what story we're telling. And so in our newsroom, we are working to add this to our routine. I used to be a team of one. Now I'm a team of about 5 of us, not including our contract writers and videographer. So we're looking to make sure we do this. My managing editor has a background in long form. He loves to tell a story. And so we talk about the narrative and plot and structure and listening and taking a deeper dive beyond the low-hanging fruit in the story. There was a story about this young man who he was trying to make it to the Olympics, and he was waiting on his phone call, which was great that he was trying to make it to the Olympics. But the bigger story was that he and his brothers really became, like, got into sports as a way to possibly help get their father out of prison. That was the story that was missing. Everybody covered that the young man boxed, but he was boxing his way to the top in order to secure funding for his dad, and nobody talked about that. And then how do we tell these stories visually? Like, what does video do? This is media across the board, and how do we tell these stories? And so we now have a photographer for Report for America, and her job is that restorative narrative. When we wrote the proposal, we wrote it for that. And so she's hanging out in the community. She's showing me things about Flint I didn't even know. Sometimes I look at her pictures and I'm like, whoa, they're doing that downtown. Or she'll hang out at the river and catch someone fishing and just have a conversation. Like, what's that person's story? And so we're taking it somewhere that right now, some of our other newsrooms, they just don't have time. It's not because they don't want to do it. We just happen to be fortunate enough to have the time to do it, where we can fill those news gaps. And so restorative narrative, I think that it doesn't just change the community, it kind of changed the journalists and the people behind it with the work you're doing. It's like the world opens up once you start working on things like this. I know it has for me. And I think that others that have experienced this, it has for them too. And it makes you want to do it all the time. It's hard as hell. Don't get me wrong, but it makes you look for those stories. Like, how can I tell a deeper story here? Be patient enough to listen. What's the story that I'm missing? What didn't I hear? So in Flint, it's something that's definitely needed, and we're working on it.
That's a really great point, Jiquanda, which makes me wonder. I know Jacqui talked about sometimes even the fellows come in and they don't quite have it. But how difficult was it for some of the journalists in your newsroom in terms of working with them on what a restorative narrative is and getting them to not only see it, but feel it?
So they just started in July. And our two focus, we focus on local government, solutions journalism, and the restorative narrative. They're young, and they hadn't yet been programmed in a way on a daily grind, a hamster wheel, the breaking news. And so they pick up this stuff. It's so easy for them, and I get, like, for me, I just happen to be in a place where we can invest in that. We just went online and we put in a whole bunch of classes for Pointer so that they could take all these different classes on writing. And that's something you don't find in newsrooms anymore. We don't have time. And so I just happen to be fortunate enough to know the great people here on this panel where we can take the time to teach young journalists how they can do restorative narrative, how they can take the time to tell stories and look beyond a meeting, look beyond the council person that's cutting a fool at the meeting and just simply ask the why. Like, who is this guy and why, and they are. So I just really expect great things for them. And I'm looking forward to it as they take this journey, in writing. So for the young folk that haven't been in newsrooms for 20 years, it's working. They don't know any other way. Like, they're working with us. One young lady, it's her first time working in a newsroom. She's done freelance work. All she knows right now is what we're teaching her. And we're running with it. We're taking advantage of it, And so we don't pump out stories every day. And our thing is, well, they may have beat us, but when we get finished, it'll be better, because they can take the time out to take a deeper dive into those stories. And it's fun.
Thank you, Jiquanda. Before we go on to Elissa, and I want to hear her project, I just want to make an announcement to remind everyone that tonight at 8 p.m. is the Peace Studios Gala, and I believe almost everyone, if not everyone on this panel, on this conversation will be attending, and we encourage you to register and participate, attend the gala. A lot of great stuff, including His Holiness the Dalai Lama will be there among others. So we encourage you to register and participate in tonight's gala. Going on now to Elissa Yancey. I introduced you earlier. Just talk to us for a bit about your project.
So probably the first and only time I will ever be mentioned in a sentence after the Dalai Lama, but I just, my story actually is ongoing too. When I was listening to Jiquanda and just hearing her story is so inspirational. Even though I was in the inaugural class of Restorative Narrative Fellows, I began a journey through that process that has informed really everything that I've done since in the world of journalism and just in the world of story gathering and story sharing. So I think there's this really idea for me about intentionality. I went into, as Jacqui mentioned, a neighborhood in Cincinnati. It's the oldest housing project in the city of Cincinnati, ostensibly to write about a book club that really became writing a story about redemption and how people find their way to one another and how people grow and build upon each other's strengths to create community in places that are drive-bys for most people. And I really got fascinated. I've been a journalist for many years, and I think, as Jacqui also mentioned, some of us are sort of wired toward restorative narrative, and that may have been my wiring, but I think what the fellowship allowed me to do was to put a finer point on that by being intentional and thinking really carefully about how the questions that we ask as journalists or as human beings really have consequences. And I think we as journalists tend to think we don't have, we're not making change with media, but we're always making change. It's whether we choose to be intentional about that act. That's the real difference for me. So what I learned through the process not only shaped how I approach asking questions, how I approach centering sources in a much more focused way. And I think you can hear that in Jiquanda's words as well, about listening and about really staying with people through struggles and through times when it feels super awkward, just to get to a deeper truth and how important that is. But I also got fascinated by thinking about the impact of what we do on the people whose stories that we're telling. So LaMonica Sherman, who was the subject of my story, has really actualized many of the goals that she set forth for herself 5 years ago in really powerful ways. And when I talked to her today, she credits the fact that she had her story told and shared in a way that focused on her strengths and focused on, I mean, I call it responsible journalism as much as anything else. There's nothing, you know, we're not hiding things in this kind of storytelling, but by being responsible and telling more of the story, it was able to shine a very different light even on her about her own life and what her life looked like from the outside and how she was shaping not only her own life, but the lives of those around her, including my own. So for me, this idea of restorative media really transcends a single form. As Judy mentioned earlier, it informed the nonprofit that I founded now, where we actually use a single photograph to invite people into deeper strengths-based conversations that kind of help with that time factor that restorative narrative can brush up against in terms of journalism deadlines, but also really changes how journalists feel about the work that they're doing, because they start to see that instead of pretending like we don't have an impact and we're just, we're Switzerland walking into a room, we realize we're also people with beating hearts, and we come with our own experiences, and we can learn as much as we can share with our sources and actually develop stories almost in more of a partnership way. And this isn't, as Jacqui would say, this is not like the hard hitting, like speaking truth to power, holding the powerful accountable, but it's more about understanding where relationships make stories better and make stories more impactful.
Listen, I'm wondering about when you talk to other journalists about this genre, restorative narrative, what kind of reaction do you get from them? Do they get it?
I have trained a lot of journalists through my work as a professor and also through a media collaborative that I'm currently leading here in the state of Ohio. And by and large, it's sort of an aha moment for a lot of them when they start to say, wait a second, actually, I understand now that I actually have to think about how I'm interacting with people and not just kind of phone it in. And that idea of being more intentional about being in conversation with another person and thinking about, like, learning to think about your sources as whole people who have these whole backgrounds they're bringing into our conversations. And again, like Jiquanda, I'm working with a lot of young journalists, like just starting out journalists, no matter their age. And to them, it's really exciting because they start to see, it's why they got into the whole world of journalism in many ways, is to tell great stories. And this is a way to tell really great stories that build understanding across difference, that build compassion across divides. And this is a really important time, I think, in history for us to shine a spotlight on these kind of stories. And the journalists, I mean, they get it. And they really, as Jiquanda was saying earlier, I think it can be, it's not that it's easy, it's really hard, but it's really satisfying in a way that other kinds of just exhausting work isn't.
You know, it's interesting you mentioned it at the point we are now in history, and I'd like to bring Judy back in, and I think she's still with us. Judy, we're at a point where it seems like there's a story about trauma every day, everywhere. Is this time made for restorative narratives?
Yeah, well, it does seem that we have a lot of stories of trauma. A friend of mine at the UNFPA said that he talked about the quantification of trauma. So yeah, there does seem to be a lot going on. I think there probably always has been a lot going on, but definitely it feels like the heat's on now. I'm actually remembering a moment that you were there for, John, when Colombia was facing their kind of big moment. They were going to have their referendum to end the conflict with FARC and trying to bring the guerrillas back into society. And we actually featured a story at one of our annual summits where the Minister of Defense called a creative agency and asked for their help to get these guerrillas to come home, because some of them have been taken as children. And so this agency did things like, one of the things they did was create these big plastic balls. In the balls were messages to them to come home, to come home for Christmas. We're waiting for you, etc. And they floated them down the Amazon River. And then they went in another move, they went to the mothers of the guerrillas, people who'd lost their kids to the FARC, and blew up these giant posters of them as children and said, please come home, and posted them in the city square in this one place where a lot of them had come from. So, what it can do to bring peace in times of conflict, regardless of the era, it's as both of the fellows were saying, it's about seeing the whole person. The kid who's boxing to liberate his dad, that's a powerful story. And with these FARC, you see them as FARC, right? They're the guerrillas. But when you look at them, they're kids. They were taken from home when they were young. They want to come home. They may want to come home. They don't know if they're welcome. So I think the stories like this can really move mountains if the storyteller really understands what they're up to. And I think we've seen some just very sophisticated, thoughtful, smart, careful storytellers. And I think Jacqui was also, I just want to say, a coach that they'll never forget.
Now, Jacqui, since your name has come up, I want to bring Jacqui back in. Jacqui, there are all these different types of narratives or genres. There's solutions, journalism, and a number of others. Do you see, for people who may think restorative narrative is not necessarily in conflict with the others, is it?
No, 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 no. I see it as one among many. I would love for every journalist, every storyteller, every music maker, every painter in the world to have that element, that ethic, that kind of view going forward. But that doesn't mean that's where they end or where they lead. They've got to do the story that is right in front of them that needs to be done. But I don't see it as replacing anything. I don't see it as, I see it as literally one in a mosaic of the kind of stories we need to tell about the human condition.
Now before we take some more, go back to our panelists, I want to mention that we will be, we're taking questions. We already have some questions that are coming in from many of you that are watching this discussion. And we will be taking your questions and answering your questions very, very shortly. But one of the things that I mentioned, Jacqui, and I'm glad that you're still up, and you may not think of this as a restorative narrative necessarily, but it's one of my favorite stories when I served at the Miami Herald, where I went to Japan a year after the tsunami, and I found a woman who was in the midst still dealing with the trauma of what she had gone through, her village had gone through, even her mother had gone through the year before. And I'm just going to read a couple graphs, and maybe we can talk some more on the other side about whether you think it can be developed into a great restorative narrative or not. But her name was Fuji Mei, and I started the story talking about Fuji Mei is still haunted by the black wall of water she saw in the rearview mirror as she raced to safety at a nearby supermarket. Peering through the windows, the store's window hours later, Mei helplessly watched her house float away, one of almost 54,000 Ishinomaki homes, 72% of all structures in this port city, destroyed in the Great East Japan earthquake. My heart still breaks for my people, said Mei, who now lived in an evacuation shelter. It's a very sad feeling. Japan will pause on Sunday to mark the one-year anniversary of the disaster. A massive 9.0 earthquake that spawned a monster tsunami and triggered a nuclear meltdown. It went on to talk about the story went on to talk about how many people were killed, etc. And then it talks about a year later, thousands of evacuees remain in shelters, and coastal cities like Ishinomaki, founded in the 4th century, are still struggling to remove tons of debris and agree on innovative recovery plans. And then went on to talk about what's happening. In fact, that a number of people who had left their homes are now looking at relocating to the base of a mountain. So if there's another earthquake and tsunami comes, they can, they're on higher ground, and 2, they can go up the mountain. So it has the beginnings, and again, I mentioned one of the stories that remain with me that I remember because this woman had such strength and power, and the story went on much further to talk about how she was able to save her mom and how she was able to then become a leader of this community. It's the kind of story that I suspect maybe have the makings of a restorative narrative. What do you think, Jacqui?
Well, sure. If you go in and ask the right questions and the answers, you're looking for her journey. All narratives are a journey, and you're looking for her journey. And then the question is, what parts of her journey get her through the day? What is she thinking about through the day? What keeps her going from one day to the next? A year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years later, where has her journey taken her? Who has she brought along with her? Who has she touched? What has she learned? what does she still hold on to for hope? This is somebody who's gone through a horrific experience, and yet there's something that keeps her going, right? She didn't just fold. The challenge with traditional journalism is that we often don't have time to go back and follow the journey through its natural human and emotional, extension. We jump in, we do it in the news, and then we move on, as opposed to going back to it. And so again, you can't force it, but yeah, there's all the elements in the world there. If you had the resources, the time, the support to go do that. And you can see examples all over. I mean, John Hershey, I mentioned him in the book Hiroshima. He went back like 20 years later and interviewed all the same 6 people that he wrote about a year after the bomb fell. He went back. And each of these people had gone through another part of their journey. Some, it wasn't happy. Others, you were like, wow, that's amazing what this person did with that experience. And I don't believe you ever force this stuff. I think that's a lie. I'm not a believer in that. But I think looking for that journey, asking about it, keeping in touch. I still keep in touch with all the people who are still living from the AIDS story. And that story was done 32 years ago. And I keep in touch with them. And I know what's happened to their journeys. And some it's been horrible, and others it's been pretty darn cool.
That the journey continues. And in fact, and this leads very nicely into one of the questions that we have from one of the people who are watching. It says, and this is a good question for you, Jacqui, and we may want to get perhaps one of the fellows to answer as well, but do the panelists view restorative narrative as a form of expressive arts therapy, a form of bibliotherapy and chemotherapy specifically?
Well, I don't, because I'm not a therapist, and I don't ever pretend to be something I'm not. For 22 years, I was in an airplane 3 times a week. I'm not a pilot or a flight attendant. Could I do the thing? Sure. But no. And I think we have to be really careful with those boundaries, because people can attach to us in a way. And some of what we do are asking similar questions. One of the smartest things I ever did as a journalist was went to a therapist myself, learn how she asked questions and how she listened and how she got things out of me and what she did to make me feel safe. But that's not my job. My job is to go and help people tell their own stories. And then I have to be really careful about my ethics and boundaries. But that's me. I don't know how Elissa feels or Jiquanda feels about that. I am not a therapist. Danger, there be dragons.
Yeah,
well, let's go to Jiquanda. I guess you wanted to touch on that, Judy, before we.
Well, I just want to say that it's dangerously close to another subject that we found ourselves in, which is the traumatization of the storyteller. We found in working with these fellows that the stories were so powerful that they were affected themselves. And of course, used to be when we started Ivo, no one ever admitted they were affected by the stories they were in. I think it was 9/11 and Katrina where I first saw journalists tear up or standing knee deep in water or whatever, admit that they were, having feelings. So we brought in trauma psychologists. I remember the first time our board member, Kevin Becker, was in the room, and he was really focused on what the journalists themselves were experiencing and how important it is for them to be aware that they're being exposed to things that are really tough for the human heart, and how themselves to be, not that restorative narrative is therapy, it's absolutely not, but that they themselves are affected sometimes by the stories they're telling, and to be astute about that. Sometime after that, there was a lawsuit that a newspaper in Australia lost, having to do with sending a reporter in repeatedly into a very tough situation without any effort to protect her, without any effort to take care of what was going on, just sending her back in. So I think there's more of an alertness now to the fact that some of these stories are quite traumatizing, actually, and that the storyteller themselves have to be aware. But that's quite different from saying that this kind of journalism is therapy. I wouldn't say that.
I want to bring in Jiquanda and Elissa on this question as well. Jiquanda, you want to go first? As being from Flint, I think that's something that you probably think about on a regular basis.
I'm definitely not a therapist, but I'm a listener. You know, I'll take the time out to listen. I'm not making any promises. It's not a session. I'm not billing you. And I do understand that sometimes people just want to be heard. And you know, I remember sitting in a funeral home for about 2 hours with this family, and their son had just died, and no reporter had did that. And at the time, the family had made a decision not to let any media in the funeral. They could only come to the viewing of the body. After 2 hours, we were invited to the funeral. They just sat and talked. The woman who was caring for the young man who died, the foster mom, he was in care of a foster mother. Media had knocked at her door and she had turned them away. I knocked, I asked, and she invited me in. She told me everything was off the record, and I told her, okay. Everybody else had left when she said it was off the record. And I just sat and I listened, and she gave us a story. So I do understand the importance of wanting to be heard. And it's simply just that. It's just wanting someone to listen, not wanting someone to give you advice, tell you what to do. It's just wanting to be heard. And this form of journalism, if you're doing it, it allows that, where you can just sit, listen, and observe. But like Judy said, we carry a lot, you know, a lot of stories, a lot of trauma. And I find myself needing someone to listen to me, needing therapy, needing someone to talk to. And I've been there, right there on the couch, you know, and it wasn't my story. It just was so emotional that it can consume you in a way. And we do have to be careful with that, even in our reporting, because it's not about how I feel, you know, at the end of the day. And I have to be able to separate myself from that. It could be as heart-wrenching as whatever. And I have to walk away and say, I have to tell their story. And sometimes you have to walk away for a second to be able to do that, you know, to be able to reflect and separate yourself from things. With the water crisis, for example, I am a Flint girl. And there was plenty of journalists who could come into the newsroom, cover it, and go home. But I would wake up in the morning, calls from my cousins, calls from my grandfather, you know, about what they were dealing with the crisis. And I remember one moment when I was going into the office and my cousin called me because she woke up and someone had delivered water overnight and left these cases of water on her porch. And she was grateful in one breath, but really hurt that this is what we were dealing with. And I couldn't carry that pain and hurt that I felt for my family into my reporting, you know. And so being in places like this where there's always trauma, we know there's trauma, there's grants here for Flint just for trauma and resilience, you know, like programs to help deal with trauma. I've taken these workshops because when I do this reporting, we're dealing with trauma. You know, you have to know how to handle people that are going through these things and not just blow it off or ignore it. It's important that we deal with people in the right way as best as we can. So in dealing with that trauma in these situations here in an area that's underserved and marginalized, illiteracy rates are through the roof. We got a water crisis, we got COVID, you know, gun violence, you know. So you're if you don't need therapy, I think you're in denial. So,
You're not being honest. One quick thing.
Thank you, Jiquanda. Elissa?
Yeah, just what I would add to this piece of the conversation is I think it's so important, and I feel really strongly about this, for journalists to be transparent with their sources and make sure they understand, because especially in communities where people aren't used to talking to reporters, they will tell you things they shouldn't tell you. they will open up in ways that are not safe for them. So it is imperative that journalists understand the importance of being open and transparent with their sources, letting them know, guiding them, being very thoughtful about what they will and will not do. They don't understand what, I mean, not everybody doesn't know what on and off the record means. Anybody doesn't know what's fair game or not. So I feel like, you know, trust in media is a really big problem. And if we are not trustworthy as individuals going into communities where people are traumatized, and whether that's crisis trauma or developmental trauma or generational trauma, it's all out there. And it is up to us as representatives of a craft and of a profession, not to mention just as human beings, to be very, very careful in this. Yes, it affects us, but we are asking people and allowing people who just need catharsis sometimes to open up to us, and we need to be really responsible with that information and make sure they clearly understand when, how, why it will be used, what is usable and what is not.
Great, thank you, Elissa. We have just about 3 minutes left, and I just want to ask one or two other really quick questions coming from the audience. And this question is for Jacqui. And Jacqui, how do we make restorative narrative more broadly recognized? No, actually, that's not the question. I wanted to ask you, though, about if there are other literature out there that people can find, can look at to talk more about restorative narrative. Where should people go?
Well, Judy might be better answering this than I am, because I don't know that it's named or labeled in other places. I think you need to know the elements and know what you're looking for and know why. And then you can, I find it every time I read the news every day. I mean, I have 15 publications that come into my house, well, online, and I find it every day. And so then I hear people saying all the news is horrible. And I'm like, no, it's not. Actually, I read this piece here and look at this and look at this. So we have to share it. We can do that now. We have to recognize it when we see it. We have to celebrate it. I'm not a scholar, so I don't know about the literature about it, other than the stuff, anything written about storytelling and its role in human history gets to this point.
Mm-hmm. And I put a few examples in there because I developed a toolkit for restorative narrative years ago. So there's some NPR stuff, there's some stuff out of Stanford, there's a lot of stuff out of University of Oregon, not only about restorative narrative named, but also about the impact of different kinds of storytelling and trauma situations.
So if anyone needs more information, they can contact the Peace Studio and we'll get them all the information that they need. Now, final question, I want to go back to that question, Judy, and I'll send this to you. How do we make restorative narratives more broadly recognized as critical to the work of peace building within the media overall?
An easy one.
Well, that's a nice little question, isn't it? You know, I mean, I think the people who practice a craft are the ones who are the best ambassadors for the craft. I mean, listening to Jiquanda, listening to Elissa, listening to Jacqui, listening to you, John, and especially when they talk about young journalists and young media people who have not yet learned other ways of coming at it, I think personal experience is probably the best. We do have some people, in the academic literature, there's a fair amount being written, but journalists aren't notorious for loving academic literature, with the exception of Elissa. And there's a textbook coming out from Paula Ellis, who was on our board, and I think it'll be out in the next 6 months or so, that features restorative narrative, among other things. You know, I think what you've heard today is about the personal satisfaction of the people telling this story and about the human dimension of going through crisis together. And it's not like a journalist who lives in a city is an observer reporting on the city. The journalist is a citizen of the city. Like Jiquanda said, you know, the phone rings and it's her cousins and it's her father and it's, you know, people on the phone wanting to talk. So I think the old idea of journalist as this detached person that doesn't kind of get touched by it is just not relevant anymore. And I don't even know that it's practiced anymore much. I mean, I think what they're saying is, you know, we live in these cities, we're a part of these cities and these towns, et cetera. We care about them, and we are, we're focusing our craft on helping restore the wholeness and witness the natural restoration that happens. You know, I would just say, I know we're close to the end, but there are resilience studies, and if you go into the psychology literature, 80% of people are naturally resilient.
Okay, well, that's a great way,
So they
great
will
positive way to end our conversation, Judy. Thank you very, very much. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and Judy, I want to thank you. I want to thank Jacqui, Jiquanda, and Elissa. Thank you for joining us for this really stimulating conversation. And a quick reminder to everyone to join us tonight at 8 p.m. for the Peace Studio Gala. Thank you all.
Thank you.
And good day.
Thanks, John.